Well, hello everybody, and thank you for coming. There's some familiar faces here. Some of you, though, I've met for the first time. You're meeting me for the first time. I'm Gareth Popkins. I'm a long-term enthusiastic language learner. I also do a bit of language tutoring and mentoring, and I have published some German courses, and you can find out about all of that at my site at howtogetfluent.com. Now, my topic today, then, is: does learning each new language get easier? Now, I want to draw on my own voyage of discovery as a long-term learner of languages. I want to uncover the effects, as I've experienced them, and some of you, I'm sure, of getting more experienced in two areas, really. With more languages, of course, but also with more experience over the years and through the languages of language learning. And explore in more detail then what gets easier as we add languages, but also maybe what doesn't. So let's start with the first part then, which is additional languages. And I'm going to throw in some practical tips and reflections as we go. So the first area I wanted to look at was sound, pronunciation, intonation. And I thought, as we get more experienced, even those of us like me without any real ear for languages, as it were, we become sort of experts. We become like a sound sommelier, perhaps. What happens? Well, various things happen, I think, as we go. First of all, when we start our first foreign language, and I'm using this terminology, L2 means your first foreign language, so L3, L4, and so on. There are all sorts of surprises that hit us for the first time, particularly if, like me, you've grown up in a very monoglot environment. You're not used to hearing different languages. One is simply that there are loads of new sounds. And as I go through, I'm very much drawing on my own experience and the order in which I've learned various languages here, rather than any higher logic. So my first foreign language at school was French, and I discovered that there were these front-rounded vowels, these U and sounds, which are extremely difficult for a Brit to get his mouth round. So a bit of practice, and I sort of got to a rough approximation some of the time, perhaps. But this immediately became easier for me when I then later on started to learn German, because lo and behold, I found the same sounds there, these U and sounds. Still difficult, but now a bit more familiar. I had something to go off. The same with Welsh, my second foreign language, my L3. The ell sound, I think it's called a lateral fricative, an unusual sound in European languages. But what do you know? When I started to learn some very basic Icelandic, I discovered there's a rather similar sound in that language. So I was experiencing brand new sounds that I had to get my tongue round. And obviously, the further I've gone, then the more I have in my repertoire, so to speak. But it's not just that, is it? It's not just new sounds. It's also new sound distinctions that we start to come across. So, for example, in English, the word little, in a received British pronunciation accent, has two different L sounds. If you ask most natives, they would say it's the same sound. There are two L's in there. But actually, the front one is this clear or light L, and the back one is a dark L. And the distinction is of no significance in English. If you mix them up, people will still understand you. You won't sound so natural if you say little, but people will understand. When I started learning Russian, I discovered that there's an approximately similar sound, both L's, but if you get them wrong in minimal pairs of languages, where that's the key sound, people might misunderstand you. So there's a word liuk, which means a skylight or a hatchway, for example, in a ship, the floor of a ship. And there's a luk with the dark L, which means an onion. So clearly, if you get these wrong, you could be misunderstood. When I went on then, having learned Russian to learn German, I discovered that, hey, it's the light L, the clear L, all the time. Even in the end position, Mantel, for example, which doesn't occur in English in the same way. So having tuned my ear a little bit more, even my tin ear, with Russian, that helped me when I then moved on to German. And then also, when I learned some basic Finnish, I spent a year as a grad student in Finland, I discovered, hey, consonants can be long or short. Again, take a minimal pair there. There's kyllä, that front U again, which means a village, and there's kyllä, which means yes, it's one of the words for yes. I thought this was pretty bizarre, pretty interesting, and it was a distinction I tried to practice. Not that I got that far with that language. But now I am really focusing on some basic Japanese, and I've suddenly found 20 years later, wow, this distinction also exists in Japan. And when I was in Tokyo a few years ago, I kept thinking, when I heard people speaking on the street, somebody speaking Finnish, and I would turn around, and it was Japanese people. And I put that down to, I explained that by the presence of these very distinctive long consonants. So new sound distinctions, and also, of course, in the range of stress and intonation. You discover, not having thought about it perhaps with your native language, that stress patterns can be very different. So in Welsh, it's quite easy because it's usually the penultimate syllable that is stressed. Gwasanaeth, llywodraeth. In Finnish or Icelandic, it tends to be the first syllable that's stressed. Russian, talk about stress in many ways, has this mobile stress where the stress moves according to the case, whether it's plural or singular, and there are various paradigms, but it is pretty difficult, at least for me. I don't know whether I will ever master it, but so there's okno, and there's okma, and there's okna, and goodness knows what else. So it is certainly one of the more challenging ones, but at least I'm aware of the importance of stress. And it's the same, of course, in suprasegmental, as they say, with intonation and patterns between words and across sentences. Intonation can be really important for communication. So it was interesting to see that Hungarian has a sort of falling intonation often throughout a sentence, different question intonation. Russian often seems to use particles for emphasis or emotion, like zh, which we don't do in English. A lot relies in English on intonation. German, there are also differences. They have these modal particles, doch, mal, which they can use to soften a command or request, when in English we would use intonation or we would use a conditional. And this can lead to misunderstandings of tone, I think, often between Germans and English people when communicating. So I become gradually a bit more aware of all that, and we can do that. So that's it then. That's the soundscape. We become sort of sound sommeliers. A few thoughts to take away. Well, let's draw on our widening repertoire to compare as we start each new language. And this should get easier, even if actually producing the sounds can remain a challenge, require a lot of work, and our performative results may vary. We can become more conscious of the range of possibilities, and we can draw on increased experience. You could also maybe think about going pro. Now, I wouldn't include myself in this category, but there are people in this room, I'm sure, who've studied phonetics and phonology. There are short courses you can do on it, or it might come up as part of a longer linguistics course. But I do have one book which I would recommend here, which is Catford, which is a short book, about 200 pages. Many of the textbooks you find are real door stoppers, sort of 400 pages. Too much for me, too hardcore. This one is great. It has audio with it, also essential, of course. You might want to learn the International Phonetic Alphabet, for example. Some people like to do that as a way of representing sounds across languages. And let's continue to explore pronunciation and training techniques and get regular feedback, just as we probably did, or I would hope we would do, in our first foreign language. So that's the soundscape. But that's only the beginning, important though it is, as we add languages. So, as well as becoming sound sommeliers, maybe we would become vocab sleuths, vocabulary detectives. spotting the familiar is one thing that gets easier the more languages you have. So, you don't have to get far with your first foreign language before you start to see some words which look perhaps a bit familiar, even if the language is quite a long way away in terms of language relationships from your native language. And of course then, the more languages we have, the more reference points, the more chance of a flash of recognition that we have. So some of these similarities are due to genetic relationships. So if we take the Germanic group, for example, there are many cognates, and I, as a native speaker of a Germanic language with a lot of Latin, Romance, Middle French, Norman French influences, have a big advantage here, as does any native speaker. But when I started to learn some basic Icelandic, I brought not only my English frames of reference, but the German that I'd learned as well. And I found words that, like Baumwolle in German, which means cotton. It's literally a sort of tree wool, a nice figurative idea. Exactly the same word with that sound at the end comes up in Icelandic. You can maybe see the similarity there. That I gather is actually a borrowing from Danish into Icelandic. With the Romance languages, French, Italian, Portuguese, you find that as well. Many familiar words coming up because they've all developed from the same root. The only Slavonic language I've learned is Russian, but already walking around the streets of Warsaw, I started to notice signs and notices that, well, I could work out what was going on, what was probably being talked about. Thanks even just to one Slavonic language in my head. So I saw this sign, samochod, here. Well, in Russian there's a word samolot, which means an aeroplane. It's literally a self-flyer. There's also a word chod, to do with going. And so this looks like a self-goer. And there's a picture of a car, which helps, from which I deduce probably that's the Polish word for car or vehicle. I hope I'm along the right lines there. But you see what I mean. And not only is it genetic relationships within language groups, but there are, of course, borrowings hopping across between unrelated languages. So when I started to learn Welsh, I was very surprised to find words which I knew from French, very similar. Ffenestr for window. Pont means a bridge. And these were borrowed into Welsh from Latin during the time of the Roman Empire and the early medieval period, when Welsh was the language spoken across the whole of the southern British island of Britain, or the parent language of Welsh, Brythonic. The days of the week as well. The days of the week in Welsh are based on the Latin gods, dydd Llun, like Lundi, dydd Mawrth, like Mardi, and so on. So I found borrowings in both languages, or evolutions from French and in Welsh as well, which really, really helped me. German and Japanese, you would have thought not likely to be many borrowings there. Japanese is very full of Chinese borrowings and a lot of modern English ones, but I also found, and I'm a basic Japanese learner, that there's the word Arbeit, which means work or a job in German. There is Arubaito in Japanese, which means a part-time job. So again, the most unexpected help came to me from German as I was learning Japanese. Then there are calques, where you have a literal translation of parts of a phrase or individual words for one concept or one phrase into another language. So in Russian, детский сад is like a child's sort of playground or sort of creche. We don't have a word in English, actually. We just took the German kindergarten, yeah? But the Russians at least went to the trouble to create a calque to translate the parts of the word. And of course, there are many of these which you will find. You have to be careful, of course, not to create them. So only use ones, I think, that you've heard in use or seen evidence for, rather than perhaps trying to create one literally yourself. You might be understood. A rather nice one I found in Hungarian, kézi csokolom, is a polite greeting from a man to a woman, perhaps. It's the German Küss die Hand, which is sort of Viennese thing that a gentleman might have greet a lady with this greeting. So again, it's a literal calque of a very idiomatic Austrian expression. So, That's great. We can spot similarities, whether they're due to genetic relationship or borrowings or calques. But of course, also, we maybe become alert to differences. Words, after all, are quite slippery things. And the range of ideas covered by a word may differ across languages. Again, something wouldn't really occur to you when you start to learn your first language. You would think, I've learned this word, it must be used in all the same, always in the same context when I'd use it in English. So a very obvious one is the color words. So the Russians, it turns out, have two words for blue. There's a word for dark blue, and there's a separate word for light blue. So they're not one color, they're two separate colors. So that was something quite new to me and something which I tended to mix up. But it turns out Italian has a similar sort of distinction. So that sort of drove home to me the idea that the range that's covered by a word, its semantic range, can differ between languages, and that sometimes reference points from another language might help me rather more than from English. Indonesian also has two words for we. They have an exclusive we, me and my friend here, but not you lot. And then they have a separate we for all of us together here, inclusive. So that's a nice, these are very vivid, simple, I think, examples. So we're alert to the slippery scope of individual words. But also maybe we are alert to the risks of false friends, because the flip side of the coin of recognizing loads of words from other languages is, of course, that sometimes there are more things to trip us up than if we were just learning our first new language. So, for example, in French, le clavier is a keyboard, but das Klavier in German is a piano. So that might be a cause of confusion. The French have a word, la blatte, which means a cockroach, and I did have there a rather lovely emoji of a cockroach, but it has not appeared. Would you believe there is an emoji for a cockroach? But das Blatt is a piece of paper in German, so again, could be a false friend if you're not careful. So we need to be alert to the flip side of having all these points of reference. So some tips to take away then. Well, be aware of correspondences between words, as I say. So, for example, there are laws. One of them is Grimm's law, discovered by Jakob Grimm here, of the Grimm's fairy tales fame, of sound shifts within language groups. So you can Google this, find out about it, but for example, between German and English, there are a whole series of consonant shifts which are pretty regular, such as the Y to the G. So English word like yellow is gestern in German. Gelb in German. Yesterday is gestern in German. You can see the Y to the G. There's also the K to the K. So Buch, Buch, make, machen. Yeah? There are regularities, and there's a list of maybe 15 German English consonants where you can see this pattern. So try and find out about those things if you're learning a new language which is in the same group as one of the languages you already know. I think that can help us. Then there are international vocabulary borrowings, for example, so that the word information, information, in English or French with this T-I-O-N ending, often, or station, it's in Spanish, tion at the end, or thou, excuse my pronunciation, with the Portuguese at the end. So these are not necessarily related languages, but this is more of a sort of international borrowings of French or Latin words across the globe. Know your history and geography as well. I think that's worth emphasizing. So Russian naval terminology, ship terminology, is full of Dutch words, interesting enough, including that very word leuk with the clear L that I mentioned earlier, which is a borrowing from Dutch. Why is this? It's because when Peter the Great wanted to build up his navy, he went and worked in the shipyards in the Low Countries, and he brought a lot of shipwright experts back with him to work for him, and hence a lot of the technical vocabulary passed into the language. So know your history. If you already speak Dutch, you might be at an advantage then if you suddenly develop an interest in Russian shipbuilding. Indonesian, Malaysian are full of layers of borrowings from Sanskrit, from Persian, and then you've got a layer of Dutch borrowings in Indonesian because of the imperial history, and similarly English borrowings in Malaysian for the same reason. So know your history will make it more interesting for you, and I think it helps us, doesn't it, to recognize and think, yeah, actually, that probably does mean what I think it does because of this background of contact through the past. So we're becoming sound sommeliers, we're becoming vocab sleuths. And as one of the things that you can do as a vocab sleuth is also draw on your memory hooks. If you like to use the link word technique to help you remember new words, then you can draw on your other languages. So the Icelandic word kunning means an introduction. To me, that looks on paper like the Welsh word cynnig, which is the word for an offer. Now, we have in English a collocation, an introductory offer. So that's a great way in my memory for me to bring these two words together and use my knowledge of Welsh to help me create a hook when I'm starting to learn that Icelandic word. So the more languages you've got, the more you can play those sort of memory games as you go as well. So sound sommelier, vocab sleuth, and maybe become grammar geeks as well. Now, when we start, the differences in grammar may turn us into nervous wrecks because we try and say everything, in the same patterns and structures as our own language. Why is this different? What do you mean they don't say it like that, But as we build and add languages, then we start to chill out a bit. So we become totally unshockable, perhaps. And we love spotting similarities. Ooh, that works the same way as in, and I'll have an example of that on the next slide, I think it is, or a couple of slides hence. But even if we don't recognize it, we are excited. We're geeks now. Ooh, that's a new way of doing this. Thanks for the pattern, the flashes of recognition as we move through languages which are in the same group. So you start to learn your first Romance language, Italian, French, Portuguese, Spanish. You find they have an incredibly complicated verb system with very complex conjugations according to the person, the time, whether it's indicative or subjunctive, and so on. But the pattern is very similar. Once you've learned one of them, you'll find that gives you a lot of credit in the bank with your next Romance language. Great. Noun cases in Russian, big nightmare. There's a picture of one of the dreaded tables of death there. And Russian speakers might not know, but your words change at the end. Your nouns change at the end. Don't know if you knew that. But this is pretty much a nightmare. But you can then find parallels throughout other Slavonic languages. Of course, there are differences too. I haven't learnt another Slavonic language, but I did give the example of the sama choda or whatever there, and I could guess that is probably a genitive ending at the end with the A. You can often see parallels, and I think if I were to study Polish then, my progress would be speeded up by this Russian, even if it's in a contrastive sense with this Russian experience. And at least, having had to try and master the Russian case system, it relativized the horror when I started to learn German and when I did some basic Icelandic, Finnish, and Hungarian. It no longer seemed such a scary prospect, though of course each of those languages also have their own challenges. Japanese particles even, where words, the role of a noun in the sentence, for example, is marked by particles, which usually come after the noun. To me, some of them work in a similar way to cases. So you use wa to mark an object. And to me, it sort of helped to think of that as sort of like a case ending. Different concept, but again, I found that helpful with that language. And patterns too. Structure patterns. So adjectival phrases. So in English, we can have two sentences. I saw the house. Jack built the house. We can connect those into one sentence with a relative clause. I saw the house that Jack built. Many languages, it turns out, I found out when I started learning Basque, don't do this. They can't do this. You have to use some sort of adjectival phrase. So you have to say something like, I saw by Jack built house. something like that. And this was, and the verb order, the sentence order is completely different because the verb is at the end in the Basque example there. But this seemed to me very, very difficult to grasp at first. Now it actually seems to me like a rather more concise, elegant way, a rapid way to express the idea. But it was pretty difficult at the beginning. But hold on a minute. I remembered that in journalistic or officialese in Russian, or in German, you can do something rather similar. So I've given this example. It's silly because this is everyday German and it should be some long official sentence, but you can do something rather similar in German, in Russian as well. And so I was able again to chill out a bit with my Basque when I remembered, oh, this is rather like what I've already experienced in some contexts in German and Russian. And what do you know, started Japanese, I found it's just like Basque. It also does these adjectival phrases. So again, no sweat, as it were, at least not in theory for me. Practice is a different matter. Now, it's true there are, of course, always patterns which remain outliers, which just remain sort of curiosities, for now at least for me. Two of those are the intransitive and the transitive conjugations of verbs in Hungarian. So I eat, the ending on the verb is different from if it's I eat the apple, if there's an object. Pretty interesting. Basque has a recent past, which you can only use for events that have happened today, which again, for now, is a new one on me, but maybe I'll come across that somewhere else at some stage. So, tips to take away. Do grasp the terminology. If you're going to learn quite a few languages, you learn your grammatical terms, the basic ones. You don't have to get lost in it. But just as a mechanic, you need to know what a carburetor is, what a starting motor is, what a fan belt is. It speeds up the discussion. It speeds up your learning if you know the difference between a verb and an adjective and what a relative clause might be and so on. You don't have to go very deep. You don't have to go very deep, but learn some basics, I think. You can maybe spot the underlying scheme. So I mentioned French verb endings or Russian case endings, and then you can focus in on some of the deviations or the differences from maybe your first language in a group when you move on. So, for example, Portuguese has these personal infinitives and a future subjunctive, which you don't have, for me, in French. So maybe I would focus in a bit more of my attention on those. And look out for the so-called Sprachbund, the language alliance, as it were. Some languages that are not related genetically, they're not in the same group, but they have rubbed along historically together in the same or adjacent territories for many, many centuries. So a lot of the languages of the Balkans, unrelated directly, so Greek, some of the South Slavic languages, Albanian, show influences, share influences in grammatical structure, in pronunciation, and sometimes also with Turkish, due to all having been in the same area for very many years. And there are always exceptions, but again, maybe it comes back to knowing your history. So there we are. Sound sommelier, vocab sleuth, grammar geek. And just quickly to say something about our experience of learning other languages. So I've talked about how maybe things have become easier for me, one or two extra bear traps, such as the false friends, from learning different languages. But what about the process of language learning itself? How can we build up experience there? Well, we deepen our knowledge about knowledge, our knowledge about learning, the so-called metacognitive skills. And we might do this in three areas. First, there's task knowledge. We get more experience of what is this thing, learning a language, getting fluent. What does it involve? What are its demands? We have better strategy knowledge in that we understand there are different ways to skin a cat, as we say. And that is, there are different approaches you can take. Comprehensible input, you can study a lot, you can start speaking early, you can start speaking late, you can use flashcards, you don't use flashcards, you can translate back and forth, you don't do that. There are different ways. But you've developed also enough personal knowledge, person knowledge, to know what works for you. Great. So as we go then, that was by definition a success story. We've learned one language, one new language. What have we learned then? Well, our success at our first language tells us, hey, I can do it. It's a wonderful confidence boost. I've done it once, I've done it twice. I can do it again. This is a hugely important thing, I think, for anybody, perhaps one of the most important benefits of having learned one language. But we also are a bit more realistic. So we have self-belief and realism, because we know it takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort. We understand, though, this long journey. So we know that there are different challenges at different levels, and that the different skills, whether it's writing, speaking, reading, require different different techniques, different approaches, and have their own inherent difficulties and excitements to them. Great. So with the knowledge of the task, what do we say? Maybe just think a bit about the order of learning. So if we start, as many people recommend, with a language close to our own, so for English speakers, that might be Dutch, or it might be a language like French, where there's very different grammar, really, but a lot of vocabulary overlap. If you then move to Japanese or to Russian, your confidence might be shaken. So I don't know how one reads that. You might say start with the difficult one first, or you might say just remember to prepare yourself for that. And it's the same process, but it might take a bit longer. There might be new challenges. And each language does tend to have a few get-out clauses. It does have, each language, maybe some easier features. And maybe if we focus on those and celebrate those initially, it will make the medicine, the more difficult things, go down slightly easier. If you're mixing up languages in one group, not really a problem I've had, because my main languages are all in different groups. So, but what people say, I think, is, maybe have one that's your pillar language. So say you learn Danish first, that's your pillar language that you want to get to the highest possible level. And then you maybe use that and refer back to that with your other Germanic languages to help you along. That might be one way of thinking about it. And also know that level is not static. You will slide back, you will go rusty, but once you've got to a sort of upper intermediate level, in particular, B2, then you only need a few days back in the country, say, or to start reading and watching again. You get back into it. It's nothing to be worried about. Even with the lower levels, there's always something stays at the back of your mind, I think, even 20 years later. And I've come back to languages with a 20-year break and found still a lot there. And language maintenance, well, that will be a separate talk, I think, in its own right, if you do want to maintain several languages at a high level. But I think one key thing might be just to, build habits into your life. Even if it's just something you do once a year, that you might go to a particular sport event or watch a particular ceremony, National Day or something each year to do with your language, or it might be something you're doing weekly or daily. Every time you're in the shower, you switch on the radio in Afrikaans or whatever it is. Build in some sort of habit to keep the language relevant, and that will help with maintenance. Strategy and person knowledge, very briefly. We got fluent in our first foreign language with a good enough blend of techniques and methods. We had materials which we liked. We found ways to keep our distinct personality engaged in the language. So we found things that worked for us. Now, what would the conclusion from that be? It might be, well, we move on to the next language, we should double down, do more of what works. And I think that is generally, for me, very good advice. But we need to ask ourselves, I think sometimes as well, did I succeed with my second, third languages? Partly not because of what I was doing, but despite what I was doing. Was I doing things that were really suboptimal, but do work over the longer term, requiring more effort? So let's continue to learn about language learning, which is one reason why we come to events like this Polyglot gathering. But of course, we shouldn't chase every shiny object, every method we suddenly discover about every new app, no. But let's keep a bit of a playful, a bit of an experimental attitude, at least with some of our language learning. And try something new, put ourselves in new situations which perhaps don't feel initially natural to us every so often. So there we are. Back to our original question. We've looked at building up experience about languages. We've looked at building up experiences about language learning, task knowledge, strategy knowledge, and person knowledge. So that leaves us with the original question: does learning each new language get easier? And I think yes is the big answer, which won't be a surprise, but I hope that we have together today thought a bit about some of the ways that that might be true. Of course, there are others as well, which I didn't have time to go into. One interesting question would be whether our aptitude, sort of our inherent wiring and ability, like our working memory capacity and so on, might improve with practice. How we gain more experience of the pragmatics, cross-cultural competence in using a language, different rules around rhetorical styles, taboo topics, body language, and so on, even the volume at which you speak. There are other things to look at too, but I think in the areas I've explored, it's pretty clear to me that the experience really does help. But learning a new language will never get really easy if we want to do it well. Each new language requires a lot of commitment over the long term. And I think you only have to ask some of the most accomplished language learners among us. I've noticed they tend to be the people who take the task the most seriously and are really always appreciative of just how much time they're going to need to get good at the language. And they take the measures, they make the choices to build that into their lives over the long term. So that really only leaves one question, which is, what about the chicks here? So as I was thinking, well, how do I sum up this talk? I thought it might be useful to come up with a nice, juicy analogy that we could apply to think about how language learning gets easier. And what I thought was maybe learning several languages is really like the experience of bringing up several children. Now, a caveat here, I say this with all the authority of somebody who doesn't have any children themselves. So apologies in advance to any parents in the audience. But I thought, well, after your first child, you know a lot about what to expect. You know the nature of the beast, as it were. However, each new one also, parents tell me, brings unexpected challenges. Each child will thrill and delight you in the old ways that you know from the earlier ones, but also in completely new and unexpected ways too. And that, I think, is why some of us like to devote ourselves to a big, rowdy linguistic brood, a noisy family of languages. Thank you very much. One or two questions have appeared, so I will attempt to tackle those now. A lot of your presentation implies a learning process of one after another. Do you think there's a merit to learning one language at a time rather than several? Well, as I was preparing this talk, I had to keep cutting chunks because it was just going to be too long. I think this is a good question. I once sort of used the analogy of lovers and languages, and I said maybe I don't know, are we going to be serial monogamists? Are we going to have a quick fling on the side, or are we straight out promiscuous with our languages? Of course, most of us will be dabbling in different languages, and there are different views on that. Some say it helps to do unrelated languages. It helps to start the next language when you are already at an intermediate level with the one afterwards. There are some who say, actually, if the languages are closely related, you can contrast more. So there's a lot to say on that, but I think basically it's what you want to do. And just remember, though, of course, time is limited, so if you're going to do two languages at once, as I've been doing with Basque and Japanese, it is going to put a break on both languages. So, but it's all about your choices, really. How do you maintain the languages as you already know and learn new ones? Well, I don't really bother much once I've got to a B2 because I know it will be there. But I have radio, I read, I follow Twitter accounts, and I know that with my C languages, there are 4, apart from English, when I go back to the country or I start using them again, it will work. It will be a bit rustier, but I know there's a very solid base there. But I do a lot of reading, I do a lot of scrolling on Twitter, I watch YouTube a lot, films, and so on. And I also have friendships, of course, and that's another area which is really important for long-term language learning. Annual events I attend, like the Welsh National Eisteddfod, which is a large cultural event, 200,000 people in a field in a different part of Wales for a week each August, and I tend to go to that, although I'm listening to Welsh radio much more often. Do you have any suggestions how to best learn verb conjugations? Tables aren't very helpful, are they, because you can't work fast enough. So I like to see the patterns, I like to look for patterns in tables, but then I like to learn example sentences or example phrases, because I figure I can sort of switch out the noun or the verb and so on. But sometimes I do just try and repeat by rote some of the irregular sort of strong verb patterns, for example, with the Germanic languages. I think there's some benefit to that. Do you ever give up on a language? No. But I do sometimes put languages on 30-year pauses. So my Hungarian is on a 30-year pause, shortly to end, because I hope to be in Budapest in October. But no, I tend to be serious when I'm starting a language. I start with the intention of getting to a sort of intermediate level with it. I'm not personally a dabbler, but many are. Any official description, dictionary of which linguistic characters? Well, you do find, I can't recommend titles for sort of descriptions of linguistic characteristics, but there are contrastive grammars of different language groups that you can find. You can also just start with, say, the Wikipedia article on Germanic languages, or take any language group, and you could start there. But there are many more academic texts, yes, on individual language groups, but they can get pretty technical pretty quickly. So I would go for some sort of overview when you're starting, rather than getting lost in the weeds. How do you maintain? Okay, I sort of dealt with that. What's your best tip to persuade people not to reply in English? I've got a blog post on this, actually, which is called something like, how do you stop them replying in English? I think you just keep going. It depends on context, but if you have taken the trouble to go to live, say, in somebody else's country, I used to joke when I lived in Germany, and this will date me, but if you want to talk to me in English, it's 40 Deutschmarks an hour. So, but likewise, I had a German housemate in London, and we spoke English because he'd chosen to come to live in Britain, and he wanted to practice his English. So I think context is a lot. You just keep going. Again, it depends on the circumstances. It also, I think, depends on how good you are. Because if basically your language is not yet up to it and you're in a busy line trying to buy a bus ticket or something, then it's not fair. You know, you need to sometimes actually up your own game. And you can also do so-called crosstalk, where you agree with somebody, you just answer in their language, and either they keep going in English or they get embarrassed. But again, you can say to people who you know, I really am trying to learn your language, or to a waiter, I'd love to practice. Often people are very positive about that, although it does depend on the country. You learn Japanese, you'll find that actually people are very keen to speak Japanese with you when you go over there. It wasn't a problem that I had, it does depend. You think we get better thinking in our target languages? Yeah, I think you do, as you get better in the language. And also because you have, I think, more sort of flexibility or conceptually. So I think there is an advantage there. Any previous experiences on previous language experience being misleading? Well, I did mention things like false friends. Sometimes you come, like when I started Japanese, I had a brand new question, which is, what do I do with the script? Am I going to learn the Chinese characters? I hadn't faced this question before. So you have to sort of come to a view, find out, and try different things. And I've actually changed approaches with that. But yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I saw the house built by Jack. You can say that, but that wasn't the point I was trying to illustrate. So I was trying to, there are many things you could say. But I would say that you could say that in English, yes, my experience suggests. So there we are. I think I did that one, the verb conjugations, which is use sample sentences. So if there are no more questions, thank you very, very much for coming. We do have more questions. Any tips on laddering? Laddering meaning using a different language to learn, using the third language to use the fourth. The laddering is used in various ways, but I'll take it that it means that in this context. So there are some more questions, goodness me. Laddering, I actually started learning Hungarian and Finnish and Italian because that's the sort of thing you do when you're 23. I don't do it anymore when I was living in German. And my textbooks are these Langenscheidt Praktisches Lehrbuch, ein Komplettwerk für Anfänger, so very German, comprehensive. So I have Assimil as well, some in French, some in German. You can do that, yeah. Sometimes it gives you a more choice of materials as well, actually, by the way. This is a problem I've had with Basque because I don't speak any Spanish. So most of the materials are in Spanish or in French. So the textbook I use, one of them is dual published with French and Spanish. There are one or two English books, but not so many. How not to forget vocabulary. You can use tricks to help you start, so like the link word technique. But the basic key, I think, is, and using context, of course, is simply repetition. It takes a lot of repetitions. Basically, you have to keep forgetting words and phrases until you don't. But once you've learned them, I find you can't forget them. You can't unlearn. I do find sometimes I learn a list of fishes or trees. 20 years later, I can remember, oh, that is a tree, but I can't remember whether it's a birch tree or an ash tree. But it's enough to help me. So I think it's repetition that's the key. Why do I keep learning languages? If I could answer that one, I'd be maybe off doing something else. I don't know, but I just can't help it. Curiosity and just the excitement, the thrill, and there are a couple more I'd like to add, but I feel, I have enough languages actually at the moment. So, just like having a family that's too big, perhaps it depends on your resources, how you can responsibly bring them up. Perhaps learn the Cyrillic alphabet. The Cyrillic alphabet you can learn in a couple of afternoons. I don't think you need any hacks, to be honest. Just practice it. Start with words that are international, like metro, and work from there. But then repeat it and do a lot of writing practice. And that works as well for the kana syllabaries in Japanese, which I did learn very early on. But it's not the Greek alphabet, the Russian alphabet. Really, this is not a big problem, although you will read more slowly for a long time. It does take a long time before you can see a sign and just hear in your head the sounds. Arabic I haven't learned, but obviously those and some of the Indian alphabets would be more complicated, Amharic or something like that. Did you always intend to become a polyglot? Well, I don't call myself a polyglot. I call myself a language enthusiast. No, I didn't used to like languages, but since my late teens, then I realized I wasn't going to be able to, once I got the language bug, I was always going to want to learn languages. So I actually was a historian, and I was studying history as my undergraduate degree, and I started learning languages on the side. I took my French up again, I started learning Welsh, and added from there. And then took choices with my career and my research to give me opportunities to learn and practice other languages. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, cheers.